I dedicate my remarks to Mitakuye Oyasin. This is a phrase from the Lakota language, an American Indian nation, that's usually translated all my relatives. It includes the entire community of life on this planet, the rocks and rivers, the mountains and valleys, the sky and the sea. And I like to translate it into Latin as fratelli tutti, all my siblings, evoking the prayer of Francis of Assisi that begins by invoking brother sun, sister moon. I would like to honor the memory of the late Pope Francis this evening by reflecting on the significance of his invitation to shape a culture of encounter in light of some of the current challenges to the relation of religion to culture and politics. So religious actors, past and present, have played fundamentally ambiguous roles in two of the greatest challenges facing the community of life on this planet. First, ethnic or racialized religious nationalism, and secondly, the ecological crisis. So in a number of contexts around the globe, past and present, some religious leaders have powerfully shaped political and cultural life by constructing or encouraging toxic forms of ethnic or racialized religious identity that support the dominance of one group over others. Now, reciprocally, some political and cultural leaders have sought to harness religious differences in order to foster a sense of oppression of other religious, ethnic, or racialized communities. In the past, empires frequently appealed to religious justifications for conquest of other peoples. So Spaniards brought a distinctively Spanish form of Catholicism, and the Portuguese a distinctively Portuguese form to the lands they conquered. There were French Catholic, British Protestant, Dutch Protestant, Ottoman Muslim, and Mughal Muslim, and Japanese Shinto empires, each with a distinctive blend of ethnic, racial, and religious identity. In many areas, these earlier empires have left behind a heritage of suspicion that challenges interreligious relations today. In my country, the United States of America, we see a resurgence of white racist Christian nationalism that prizes white Christians as the true citizens of America and looks down on persons of color and those who are not Christian. In many settings around the world today, there are analogous forms of religious nationalist movements. In many places, indigenous communities have suffered discrimination. In each of these instances, some other religious leaders have vigorously contested the discriminatory programs as fundamental violations of the religious values and have worked to shape a healthy community of the world's religions and cultures. So scholars have debated to what degree do political leaders manipulate religious and cultural symbols, and to what degree do religious leaders take advantage of political and cultural forces for their own purposes? To my mind, the influences can be reciprocal, so each side can do this for its own benefit. In some cases, the religious, the cultural, the political can hardly be distinguished. So that's one major crisis. Another crisis is the ecological situation. The threat of global catastrophe fostered by what Pope Francis called the technocratic paradigm that values all human activity according to its profitability and denies the intrinsic value of non-human creation. To a large degree, the development of contemporary politics and culture has relied on the unlimited exploitation of natural resources with a reckless fervor that displays little concern for the impact on the entire community of life. And here also, religious leaders have played ambiguous roles. Some Christian leaders have proposed strongly anthropocentric visions of creation, interpreting the creation narratives in the book of Genesis as authorizing humans to dominate and subdue the rest of creation for their own purposes, seemingly without limit. It's widely known that the intellectual historian Lynn White, Jr., proposed many years ago that some medieval Catholic understandings of creation supported the instrumentalization of nature and the modern assault on the environment. What's usually not mentioned, it's less remembered, is he concluded his famous essay by holding up the ideal of Francis of Assisi as an alternate model. Pope Francis took up the example of St. Francis of Assisi as a model of honoring all creatures as our sisters and brothers. Pope Francis forcefully rejected anthropocentric interpretations of the book of Genesis. He decried the role of technocracy in our world and held up the example of Francis of Assisi as a patron of ecology. Meanwhile, the ecumenical patriarch of the Eastern Orthodox Christians, Patriarch Bartholomew, is known as the Green Patriarch. He has a long-standing advocacy of ecological values as flowing from Christian faith as understood in the Eastern Orthodox Christian traditions. Similarly, many Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, Taoists, Jewish, Confucian, and indigenous leaders have interpreted their respective traditions in ways that support ecological integrity. Pope Francis set forth the challenge, I quote, "Given the complexity of the ecological crisis and its multiple causes, we need to realize that the solutions will not emerge from just one way of interpreting and transforming reality. Respect must also be shown for the various cultural riches of different peoples, their art and poetry, their interior life and spirituality. If we are truly concerned to develop an ecology capable of remedying the damage we have done, no branch of the sciences and no form of wisdom can be left out. And that includes religion and the language particular to it," end quote. So that's the challenge Pope Francis gave us in Laudato Si. So Pope Francis invited all persons of goodwill to shape what he called a culture of encounter, meaning a forum in which all persons and their religious traditions find respect. He also called for a culture of integral ecology in which all creatures, human and non-human, receive honor and care. Because the challenges are global, the responses must be global. And Pope Francis acknowledged believers have not always been faithful to the treasures of wisdom which we have been called to protect and preserve, he said. And so he urgently called us to a return to the sources, our scriptures and traditions, in order to respond to the current needs. I would like to propose 5 areas where religious and interreligious leaders can work with political and cultural leaders in shaping a constructive culture of encounter. So aesthetics, academic sharing, spiritual encounter, concern for the world, and friendship. So to begin with aesthetics. When a program of ethnic or racialized religious nationalism dominates political and cultural life, art and literature are valued primarily for their ability to celebrate the domination and oppression of subaltern communities. This runs through much of imperial and colonial art and literature. When a technocratic paradigm dominates cultural life, then art and literature are valued for profitability. How much money can we make? And Pope Francis lamented that modern technocracy objectifies all creatures as nothing more than resources for human exploitation. This warps our culture and politics into patterns of behavior based on domination, manipulation, and profit-seeking. In his famous poem, God's Grandeur, the English Jesuit poet Gerard Manley Hopkins addressed this danger. So this is 100, 150 years ago. He lamented the dynamic of modern economic life that deadens human sensitivity to the grandeur of God in nature. I quote, "And all is seared with trade, bleared, smeared with toil, and wears man's smudge and shares man's smudge. The soil is bare now, nor can foot feel being shod." So artists, musicians, and literary writers have the potential to shape cultural perceptions and values for better or for worse. Great works of art can reach across religious, cultural, and political boundaries to communicate fundamental insights into the cosmos, including the intrinsic value and beauty of the natural world. Works of art, music, and literature powerfully shape our perceptions of the world from the time we're young. And early works of art and literature emerged from religious contexts. So this is one area of interreligious exchange. But again, we inherit an ambiguous history. These works of art can reflect agendas of domination and discrimination. A lot of traditional Christian art presented Jews and Muslims in very negative forms as sinners. And so if you look at traditional images of Jews, often they're the enemies of Christ collectively. And often their facial features are kind of exaggerated, and so they're portrayed as almost less than human. On the other hand, art, music, and literature can express with revolutionary power the suffering of the marginalized, and it can invite empathy, compassion, solidarity with them. Art, music, and literature can celebrate our connection with nature, can give voice to the subjectivity of non-human creatures. This is where St. Francis of Assisi gives us a model in what is a poem in Italian. It's a dialect of Italian from his period that was just developing, where he's praying, Laudato Si, may God be praised through, by, and for all creatures. Brother sun, sister moon, brother wind, sister water, brother fire, and our sister mother earth, a deliberately paradoxical image. The late geologian Thomas Berry challenged us to shift from seeing nature as a collection of objects to celebrating nature as a communion of subjects. And this is where art, music, and literature can be very powerful ways of pursuing this. And again, in response to the technocratic reason that can seem so powerful in our world, Pope Francis points out beauty can awaken us. Beauty can slip in, even in a rigorously economic model, and express the intrinsic value of human life and nature. Pope Francis tells us, yet we can once more broaden our vision. An authentic humanity, calling for a new synthesis, seems to dwell in the midst of our technological culture, almost unnoticed. Like a mist seeping gently beneath a closed door. Will the promise last, in spite of everything, with all that is authentic rising up in stubborn resistance? That's Pope Francis's question. Gerard Manley Hopkins' poem offers an answer. And for all this, nature is never spent. There lives the dearest freshness deep down things, and though the last lights off the black west went, O morning at the brown brink eastward springs, because the Holy Ghost over the bent world broods with warm breasts and with bright wings. Often works of art, music, and literature are the most powerful forms of communication across religious boundaries. The Interfaith Council of Washington, D.C., where I live, hosts an annual interfaith concert in which musicians from various traditions present the riches of their heritage. So one evening we were in a synagogue, a Reformed Jewish synagogue. I used to co-chair a dialogue with the former rabbi of that synagogue. We had whirling dervishes from the Sufi Muslim world. Now, my Muslim friends told me this is the first time in history that whirling dervishes have danced in a synagogue. History is long, and I'm not sure that's true, but it's certainly distinctive. Those dervishes also danced in one of the office buildings of the U.S. Congress, the Cannon Office Building. We also had Hindus whirling and whirling. They were chanting Ram, 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 Sita, Ram, honoring Ram and Sita in the Hindu tradition. And it was a very, very vigorous rhythm going around. In addition to inviting reverence for the experience of the sacred in the world of nature, works of art can evoke a sense of the transcendent. And again, this can go across religious and cultural boundaries. And so it brings us into a broader world of global awareness. On the global stage, we met in 2004 in Barcelona. And in front of the Cathedral of La Sagrada Familia of Gaudi, one of the most famous architectural monuments of the 20th century, we had a performance of religious works from, again, a variety of traditions. So again, there were the whirling dervishes, there were songs from a wide variety of religions, dances, and it was a wonderful coming together of the world's traditions. Last summer, I visited Father Aloysius Pyrrhus in Colombo, Sri Lanka. He was one of the first Jesuits to get a doctorate in Buddhist studies, and he invites Buddhist artists in Sri Lanka not to convert, but to portray in works of art biblical figures. And so it's 50 years since he set up the Tulana Center, a research and retreat center, and it's filled with these images. Some are paintings, some are sculptures, and we had a meeting one day, it was a group of Jesuits I was with there, with one of these Buddhist artists to come over and talk about his response to biblical figures. So there's an image of Jesus and the Samaritan woman, and she's portrayed as low caste, and Jesus is lower than her. And so it's kind of interpreting the cultural traditions of South Asia in relation to the gospel image. Another area is academic sharing. So academic life can be a battleground where national, ethnic, religious, and individual egos clash in a struggle for power. It can also be a grace-filled exploration of the wonders of a world open to transcendence and the sacred, where humans acknowledge the ancient lesson that true wisdom means acknowledging our limits. Tragically, much of the history of intellectual life demonstrates that scholars can pursue knowledge in ways that support military, political, cultural, and religious dominance. So again, it's an ambiguous heritage. Behind academic pursuits are philosophical and religious assumptions that often seem self-evident and unquestionable until they're challenged by diverse perspectives. So scholars who engage in comparative religious and philosophical studies encounter horizons very different from their own. And so on the one hand, there's a huge challenge of understanding. What do you make of these strange people? They're saying things I've never heard before, and this doesn't make any sense to me. On the other hand, there's an opportunity to reflect in a new way on our own unspoken assumptions so that they can be recognized and critiqued. And again, our history is ambiguous. We can encounter other horizons only to reinforce cultural biases and religious prejudices. And there's a long history of anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, anti-Asian, anti-Indigenous, anti-Black racism. It goes on and on. But there's a huge opportunity to learn, including learning from the mistakes of the past. And today there's a whole history of critique of the claims of objectivity. So much of modern science claimed to be objective while it was actually racist or religiously biased or whatever. One of my colleagues at Georgetown, Charles King, wrote a history of early anthropology in North America, where Franz Boas came from Germany, trained a whole circle at Columbia University, challenging the widespread racism of the anthropologists in the late 19th, early 20th century. I had an anthropologist in my parish, one of the leading scholars of African American experience in colonial America. He had done archaeological excavations throughout Maryland on this. And he exclaimed to me, to his surprise, this historian is teaching my own field, because he didn't know as much about the earlier history as the historian did. So again, we're coming out of a troubled history. There's a whole critique of Orientalism, where the West constructed a certain image of the Orient, often exotic, sometimes sexually alluring, but all tied into the European empires. And so it's a mixed bag. So people talk about this epistemic violence of imperial projects, And so what we need now to do is seek new forms of knowledge that acknowledge the dignity, ability, and agencies of all people. And here there's all kinds of possibilities for interreligious exploration. When I was a graduate student at the Divinity School of the University of Chicago, Professor Misao Abe came as a visiting scholar. He was a representative of what's called the Kyoto School of Japanese Buddhism. This goes back 1911. A Japanese Buddhist philosopher was lecturing on Hegel, studying William James, wrote a whole book, The Idea of the Good, presenting in Western philosophical terms the experience of Zen Buddhism without ever telling you what he's doing. He never mentions the word Zen, so it's very Zen. He's describing experience. Once I was in Kyoto going into a temple, I asked a Zen Buddhist, what is Zen? Living in the present. This is one of the most powerful cross-cultural, interreligious, intellectual movements of the last 100 years or so. A number of these people went to Germany. Abe came to the United States. They spent years studying Western philosophy and Christian theology. And so when Abe said something and Hans Kuhn criticized him, he would respond by quoting Karl Rahner. Abe read Christian texts with Buddhist eyes. And this is one of the most important things we're doing today. So we know the hymn in the letter of Paul to the community in Philippi. Though he was in the form of God, he did not deem equality with God something to be grasped at, but emptied himself, became subject to human limitations, subject to death, death of a slave. Because of this, God gave him the name above every name. Mahayana Buddhist logic, A is not A, therefore A is truly A. The Son of God is not the Son of God, therefore the Son of God is truly the Son of God. Son of God is not the Son of God because he emptied himself, died the death of a slave. Therefore, he is truly the Son of God. And so Abe would go around proposing this in dialogue with both Jews and Christians. There's like 3 books. Abe gave me this essay before it was published on the emptying God and dynamic shunyata. So he was interpreting the Christian notion of God in light of Buddhist notions of emptying. And he would ask Christians, can you say God is emptying? And a lot of people said no. He wanted an authoritative answer, so my friend Donald Mitchell took him to the Vatican, and advisors to then Cardinal Ratzinger said yes. Because you can read the whole Trinity in terms of emptying. The Father empties himself, gives away everything to the Son except the distinct property of being Father, and then the Father and Son empty themselves in the love that is the Holy Spirit. Now, Abe and these theologians, it was Piero Coda and Jacques Servet, they knew that it doesn't function the same in the tradition. So emptying in Buddhism is different from emptying in Christianity, but there's an area of convergence that can shed new light on each side of these. I was involved in Jewish-Christian dialogue for many years, and one of the most important elements here is Jews reading Christian texts as Jewish texts. So much of the New Testament can be read as Jewish texts. And then the same way in the early church, we always knew there were some Jewish Christians. They were thought to be kind of small, marginal groups on the side. Now it seems they were much more widespread, and this lasts into the 4th and 5th century. When John Chrysostom attacks the Jews, he's not worried about the Jews in their own community. He's upset because his people, his congregation, are going to the synagogues for the Jewish festivals. And so we have a whole new exploration of the parting of the ways. But there were Jews who honored Jesus for hundreds of years, and it's only in the 4th, 5th century that we were divided. I was involved in dialogue with Muslims in both the Midwest and Mid-Atlantic dialogues of Muslims and Catholics. And here again, we would talk about common themes like the Word of God. And so I gave a presentation on themes in the New Testament for Muslims, and then they presented themes on the Quran for us. And we wrote a small book, Revelation in Catholic and Muslim Perspectives, that's intended as a kind of a conversation starter. So it's a type of thing you can read and then invite further discussion on the meaning of revelation. I was in a number of discussions at the Istanbul Foundation for Science and Culture, in which Muslims, especially in Turkey, but also beyond, were presenting one of their heroes, Bediüzzaman Said Nursi, lived from roughly 1880s till 1960s, as a model for Muslims to be in good interreligious relations with other people, and also in a positive relation to modern science. And so these were Muslims presenting to Muslims from throughout the entire Islamic world. People came from all over the Islamic world to Istanbul for these meetings. And then I would do comparisons of Said Nursi to Christian theologians like Jürgen Moltmann and Karl Rahner. And then my final talk was on Pope John the 23rd, who was in Turkey for 8 years as the Pope's representative in Istanbul. I never found that they met, but there's a certain convergence between John the 23rd and Said Nursi. Spiritual encounter. So again, the spirituality of a religious community is one of the most powerful factors shaping its identity. And again, our legacies are ambiguous. So spiritual encounters can be warped by historic conflicts and animosity. And a lot of the earlier Christian tradition read the Bible in a spiritual sense against the Jews. And then we read it later against the Muslims. And so just because you're being spiritual doesn't mean you're free from dangers. All of Christian life is subject to distortion. And this is where leaders have been aware that the Catholic Church has a conflicted history. So Pope John Paul II dramatically addressed this. 1986, he invited the leaders of all the world's religious traditions to come to Assisi in Italy. Again, home of St. Francis of Assisi. He didn't invite them to Rome. He invited them to Assisi to pray for peace in the middle of the Cold War. So at this point, the Soviet Union and the United States have major nuclear arms ready to go on a minute's notice. And so the Pope thought it may help if all the world's religious traditions come together to pray. And he dramatically asked Catholics to go through a purification of memory, because he knew the history of how we have often offended followers of other traditions. And so he acknowledged that we need to ask forgiveness for the sins that earlier generations of Catholics have committed against followers of other traditions. And he didn't try to have a common prayer. So it wasn't like a lowest common denominator where everybody can say the same prayer. That would be so generic. And with Buddhists, they don't really pray to God in the sense that Christians, Jews, and Muslims do. And Hindus have a whole variety of practices, so there's much diversity. So what he said was, we can be present while others pray. And he was very explicit. Every genuine prayer is inspired by the Holy Spirit. So in the spiritual encounter, he was inviting people to pray according to their own tradition, but in this new communion of people from different traditions coming to be present while others pray. On a more regional level, we did this in the United States at both the Midwest and Mid-Atlantic dialogues of Muslims and Catholics. So I sat with a Catholic bishop and other Catholic leaders in the back of the mosque in Indianapolis while the Muslims did their evening prayer. And then they were present while we Catholics did the Vespers from the Liturgy of the Hours in our evening prayer. And so we talked about using the Psalms and the Lord's Prayer. There's a number of Psalms that, at least in the United States, Jews, Muslims, and Christians have agreed we can pray together. So for Jews and Christians, this is no problem because we pray the Psalms all the time. And Muslims believe the Psalms were given as revelation to what for them is the prophet David. They call it Zabur. They don't accept necessarily the entire text of the Hebrew Bible, but they believe that Torah was given to Moses, and Zabur, the Psalms, was given to David. And so this is scripture for them, even though there may be questions over the current text. And so when I was teaching at the University of St. Mary the Lake near Chicago, we had annual retreats of Christian priests and ministers with rabbis, where again we would pray together. In 1986, I went to Thailand and wanted to learn about Buddhist monastic life, so I spent a short time in the monastery of Wat Rempeng near Chiang Mai. And I was there hoping I'd have some good conversations. My Buddhist hosts assumed I was there to learn Vipassana meditation. And so I was to be in silence morning, noon, and night. The opening evening, I was just wandering around before I went into meditation, and the ordinary monks, they were very eager to talk. But they wanted me to just follow my breath, do walking and sitting meditation. First day, the monk told me, I want you to meditate 8 hours a day. So I thought, that's not so bad, 8 hours I can do. So I had been doing this for a while. In the afternoon, I took a break. And it was late afternoon, and this was a monastery of both monks and nuns. And so I went outside for a walk, and the monks on one side and the nuns in a different part were chanting the Pali Canon. So these are the earliest Buddhist scriptures. So it was lovely. So next morning I come in to my meditation teacher, and his first line to me is, "You're not meditating 24 hours a day." And I thought, you didn't say 24, you said 8. I don't want you walking around looking at statues. I want you to be meditating every moment that you're awake. And so that was a real challenge. The days seemed very, very long. I never got to a state of samadhi, but I learned about how one is introduced to Theravada Buddhist meditation practice. And I've sat a number of later retreats. And there's a whole number of Christians in the United States who have done this. Carmelites usually do Theravada Buddhist Vipassana or insight meditation. Jesuits tend to do Zen. And each of them have developed a type of harmony between their respective Carmelite or Jesuit Christian spirituality and the Buddhist teachings. Because cosmologically, we're very, very different from Buddhists. But in terms of what gets us into trouble and what is a virtuous life, there are very powerful areas of convergence. Another area is concern for the world. And again, this can go either way. Concern for the world can be part of the whole polarization. But shared concerns for relieving suffering has been one of the most powerful historical movements to bring us together. So traditionally, Christians often placed truth at the center of their perspective for encountering other religious traditions. So Catholic Church has the entire truth. Everybody else is somewhat in error, some more than others, but we have the truth, and everybody else to one degree or other is wrong. And so this approach usually reinforced mistrust and misunderstanding and just contributed to conflicts. September 11th, 1893. First convening of the World Parliament of Religions in Chicago. The Archbishop of Chicago, Patrick Fian, from Tipperary, Ireland, welcomed everybody with an invitation to respectful dialogue. No Catholic leader, to my knowledge, had ever done this on a world platform with Hindus, Buddhists, Muslims, Jews, Confucian leaders there. Then James Cardinal Gibbons, the Archbishop of Baltimore, most prominent U.S. Catholic leader of the late 19th, early 20th century, he had written a talk. He didn't give it because he wasn't feeling well, so Bishop John Keane read it. But he set the agenda. I quote, "Though we differ in faith, thank God there is one platform on which we stand united, and that is the platform of charity and benevolence. Never do we approach nearer to our Heavenly Father than when we alleviate the sorrows of others." He concluded his address by quoting the pagan Cicero. "There is no way by which humans can approach nearer to the gods than by contributing to the welfare of their fellow creatures." And leaders from other religious traditions express similar types of sentiments. So obviously there are doctrinal differences, there are often philosophical differences, but when people are in need, we can make a difference. Little over 20 years later, World War I. In World War I in the United States, Roman Catholic bishops for the first time collaborated with Protestants and Jews in relieving suffering. So they were trying to organize relief efforts for all the people affected by the fighting and displacement and all the horrors. And Pope Benedict XV implemented the program of Cardinal Gibbons. Now, I don't know to what degree Cardinal Gibbons told the Pope about his talk, but he was a liaison between the US President Woodrow Wilson and Pope Benedict XV. It was Cardinal Gibbons who arranged for Woodrow Wilson to visit Pope Benedict after the war ended in 1919 when Woodrow Wilson went to Europe. So Benedict XV placed charity and benevolence in the forefront of the papacy's relationship to everybody. So he condemned the war as the suicide of Europe. He gave away all the money of the Holy See and his own family. At his death, the Holy See had about $19,000 in the bank, roughly $350,000 today, but he had given away everything that they had. He didn't care if you were Jewish or Muslim, or Eastern Orthodox, or Catholic. And the world noted this. So after the war was over, the final Sultan of the Ottoman Empire donated money to erect a statue of Pope Benedict XV in Istanbul. Now give me a break. Sultans don't set up statues to popes. I have had Muslim colleagues tell me flatly, this is not possible. But the statue stands today in the courtyard of the Catholic Church of the Holy Spirit in Istanbul with the inscription, "To the great Pope of the world's tragic hour, Benedict XV, benefactor of all people without discrimination of nationality or religion, from a grateful Orient, 1914 to 1918. A young Italian army chaplain was quietly watching what Pope Benedict was doing, and 20 years later, he walked past that statue every day for 8 years. He was the Pope's representative in Istanbul from 1936 till 1944, Angelo Giuseppe Roncalli. During World War II, he followed the example of Pope Benedict XV and did everything he could to save the lives of Jews from the Nazi Shoah, the Holocaust. He approved the signing of forged baptismal certificates. So this was for Jews who were not baptized. They were not going to be baptized, but if this will save them from the Nazis, go ahead and issue the baptismal certificate. Jews remembered this. A few years later, he becomes Pope John the 23rd, calls an ecumenical council with an idea of reunification of the Christian world. When he called it in 1959, he was not thinking interreligiously. Jewish historian Jules Isaac lost most of his family in the Shoah. He knew what Angelo Roncalli had done and asked for an audience and received it, June 1960. As soon as Jules Isaac walked into the room, Pope John the 23rd later recalled he had immediately the idea, of course, we have to make a statement on the Jewish people. Because he knew the long history of anti-Jewish attitudes and actions of the Catholic Church. And this was not on his original agenda. The historian then presented a request that the Catholic Church change its teaching about the Jewish people, and he presented to the Pope the catechism issued after the Council of Trent, which says, Jesus Christ died for the sins of all people. And so the question from the Jewish historian, if this is your teaching, why do you blame the Jews? At the end of the meeting, the Jewish historian asked the Pope, do I have reason for hope? The Pope replied, you have reason for more than hope. And then he commissioned Augustine Cardinal Bea, Jesuit German biblical scholar, who in the 1920s had called for a change in Catholic teaching and attitudes towards the Jewish people. So he shepherded the document on the Jewish people that became Nostra Aetate. It was a long, complex history of discussions that I won't go into. But this sets the stage for where we are today. And both Pope John Paul II and then Pope Benedict and Pope Francis developed this basic platform. Pope John Paul II addressed 100,000 young Muslims in Casablanca, Morocco, August 19th, 1985. And he said a lot of things. He talked about we must respect each other. We must stimulate each other in good works on the path of God. Dear young people, I wish that you may be able to help in thus building a world where God may have first place in order to aid and to save humankind. On this path, you are assured of the esteem and the collaboration of your Catholic brothers and sisters whom I represent among you this evening. No pope in history had addressed 100,000 young Muslims with anything like this before. Then February 4th, 2019, Pope Francis and Ahmed al-Tayeb, the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar University in Cairo, issued the Declaration on Human Fraternity for World Peace and Living Together. And they repeated a lot of the concerns that I began this talk with of Pope Francis about the situation that we're in. So they named various dangers like a desensitized human conscience, a distancing from religious values, a prevailing individualism accompanied by materialistic philosophies that deify the human person and introduce worldly and material values in place of supreme and transcendental principles. They decry the unequal exploitation of natural resources, quote, which only a rich minority benefit from to the detriment of the majority of the peoples of the earth. Then they very powerfully, quote, resolutely declare that religions must never incite war, hateful attitudes, hostility, and extremism, nor must they incite violence or the shedding of blood. These tragic realities are the consequence of a deviation from religious teachings. They result from a political manipulation of religions and from interpretations made by religious groups who in the course of history have taken advantage of the power of religious sentiment in the hearts of men and women in order to make them act in a way that has nothing to do with the truth of religions. And then they conclude, God the Almighty has no need to be defended by anyone and does not want his name to be used to terrorize people. And so what do? They called for respect for the humanity of all communities and urged the adoption of a culture of dialogue as the path, mutual cooperation as the code of conduct, reciprocal understanding as the method and standard. And other traditions have joined in. Du Weiming, one of the most prominent Confucian leaders in the world, has a whole critique of the Enlightenment paradigm for its technocracy and anthropocentrism, and in ways that converge very strongly with Pope Francis's call in Laudato Si, calls for the Confucian community to work with all other religious traditions, and mentions in particular indigenous traditions around the world of learning how Confucian ethics can contribute to this dialogue with other communities. I'd like to conclude with the theme of friendship. So one of the greatest losses in technocratic paradigms is that there's no room for a genuine friendship. Technocracy values all relationships by their profitability, measuring the usefulness of every relationship by economic criteria. So how much money can I make from this interaction? How much money are you worth to me? And money, of course, leads to power. So genuine friendship based on shared transcendent values and human values then just kind of evaporates, disappears. Now, the ancient writers, including people like Aristotle and Cicero, as well as authors from every great religious tradition, have long known that this is not a basis for true friendship. At the second Gethsemane encounter at the monastery of Thomas Merton in Kentucky, Bhante Gunaratana, the Theravada Buddhist based in the United States, started off with the Buddhist value of friendship. So every tradition has its own approach to this. So friendships across traditional religious boundary lines can be among the most powerful transformative influences. And they can have a kind of a radiant effect on all kinds of other people. And so despite this troubled history that we inherit, again and again, when people actually get to know somebody concrete from another tradition, often that can be a powerful way to dispel the stereotype. Oh, I thought you people were all like this, but you're not like that, and you're you. One time, some years ago, I chaired a week-long discussion, a Buddhist-Catholic dialogue around the world. And from different contexts, everybody agreed the key to Buddhist-Catholic dialogue is lunch. Over lunch, you realize, oh, you're concerned about this. Well, I'm concerned about this. Over lunch, you get to know your neighbor. Over lunch, you're not in a formal academic religious role representing, you're a human neighbor. And if you establish this kind of relation as a neighbor, then the more formal shared dialogue can take a different direction and have a different richness. December 1964, Pope Paul VI made the historic first papal journey to India. So on the one hand, he was there for the International Eucharistic Congress in Bombay. He also met with leaders of other religious traditions. So as you know, India is home to a wide variety of different religious traditions. So all the different traditions of India are here in the assembly. And again, I'm not sure any pope in history had ever addressed an audience quite like this. And I want to share with you his appeal for friendship. Therefore, we must come closer together, not only through the modern means of communication, through press and radio, through steamships and jet planes. We must come together with our hearts in mutual understanding, esteem, and love. We must meet not merely as tourists, but as pilgrims who set out to find God, not in buildings of stone, but in human hearts. Man must meet man, nation meet nation, as brothers and sisters, as children of God. In this mutual understanding and friendship, in this sacred communion, we must also begin to work together to build the common future of the human race. We must find the concrete and practical ways of organization and cooperation so that all resources be pooled and all efforts united towards achieving a true communion among all nations. Such a union cannot be built on a universal terror or fear of mutual destruction. It must be built on a common love that embraces all and has its roots in God, who is love. Now today, we're called to broaden the notion of friendship beyond the human world to include non-human creatures. So I mentioned Thomas Berry before. He was a great cross-cultural historian, promoter of interreligious scholarship and friendship, and he reflected on the need that humans have for companionship with other creatures. And he suggested that adults should learn from little children, 2, 3, 4 years old. What is their world like? This is Thomas Berry. We can hardly communicate with them in any meaningful way except through pictures and stories of humans and animals and fields and trees, of flowers, birds and butterflies, of sea and sky. These present to the child a world of wonder and beauty and intimacy, a world sufficiently enticing to enable the child to overcome the sorrows that they necessarily experience from their earliest years. And so he went on, the child experiences the friendship relation that exists among all things throughout the universe. Indeed, we cannot be truly ourselves in any adequate manner without all our companion beings throughout the earth. This larger community constitutes our greater self. This resonates with the American Indian, and specifically Lakota sense, that we are intimately linked to all forms of life, as all my relatives, Mitakuye Oyasin. One of the leading American Indian intellectuals was Vine Deloria Jr. He comments, the phrase all my relatives is frequently invoked by Indians performing ceremonies, and this phrase is used to invite all other forms of life to participate, as well as to inform them that the ceremony is being done on their behalf. The late 16th century, Matteo Ricci went to China. He was one of the first Jesuits to really immerse himself in the Chinese language and culture, and was welcomed even to Beijing at a time when Westerners were not usually welcome there. And he stressed above all the transforming power of friendship across cultural and religious boundaries. So what he did was he studied the Confucian tradition in depth, and he impressed the Chinese with his knowledge of the Confucian tradition. After a while, he dressed as a Confucian Mandarin and was respected by his Confucian friends. He edited a collection of aphorisms concerning friendship. And this became one of the most frequently copied works of the late Ming Dynasty in China. And today it's a classic witness of the power of friendship across religious and cultural boundaries. So one of the sayings, the Lord on high gave people 2 eyes, 2 ears, 2 hands, and 2 feet, so that 2 friends could help each other. Only in this way can deeds be brought successfully to completion. And then he comments, one Chinese word for friends is written with the character for 2 hands. Things are possible with them and not possible without them. Another Chinese word for friends is written with the character for 2 wings, because only because birds have them are they able to fly. Did not the ancient sages thus regard friendship in the same way? One of the aphorisms tells us, a world without friends is a world without joy. In a time of multiple global challenges, I'd like to close with a final Chinese wisdom saying, a friend is the riches of the poor, the strength of the weak, and the medicine of the ill. I thank you for your attention.
Thanks, excellent talk. I think one of the strengths you really covered there was that the work that we do in Christian interreligious dialogue, I think we have tended for a long time to focus on our relationship with the Abrahamic faiths. Mm-hmm. And I think you touched on beautifully that tradition in India going back before the 1960s and I think very much the emerging tradition of the Buddhist Christian dialogue. Do you feel that's the way forward? We see a lot more of that happening from the Vatican dicasteries, more emphasis on that we need to broaden our scope a lot more to ensure that we're dialogue on a constant basis with all the people of God, with all faiths, and not focus so much just on the Abrahamic traditions.
Yes. A month ago, we had the 8th International Colloquium of Buddhist Christian Dialogue organized by the Dicastery for Interreligious Dialogue in Phnom Penh. And so I was there. I was one of the opening speakers for it. And we had the new cardinal, who's the leader of the dicastery, Cardinal George Kuvakad. He's from the south of India. I think he's Syro-Malabar Rite. And then Cardinal George Morenga from Mongolia. Mongolia has a cardinal now. He was there. And then Cardinal Stephen Cho from Hong Kong was there. So we had 3 cardinals. So this is a level of the commitment of the upper level of the Catholic leadership for this type of dialogue. And we were asked to speak about peace, reconciliation, and resilience. So in a sense, the new word here is resilience in terms of the international interreligious discussions. And so I reflected, there's a Catholic professor of law at Harvard University, Robert Bourdon, who has a book, Conflict Resilience, saying, don't be too quick to think you can resolve every conflict. You may not be able to resolve them, but you can shape what you bring to a conflict, and it's a model of deep listening, which really resonates deeply with the Buddhist tradition, that if you shape what you bring to the relationship in an attitude of respect and really try to understand the other side, doesn't mean you give up your own values, doesn't mean you agree with everything they're saying, but you really try to imaginatively put yourself in their place, that will shift the relationship over time in a positive direction. And so a lot of people responded positively to that kind of a suggestion. The other major Vatican initiative is they're planning a new document on Catholic principles for dialogue with the Confucian tradition. So a year ago in March, I was in Taipei at Furen Catholic University. I was already scheduled to be there giving a couple lectures, and then I was asked if I could stay to be part of a consultation. And we had Professor Yao Xinzhong from Renmin University in Beijing. So he's probably the second most prominent Confucian leader writing in English. So Du Weiming is the most prominent. Du Weiming used to be at Harvard and then went to Beijing at the end of his career to try to animate Confucian reflections in dialogue with the whole world. And so both of these figures, as Confucians, are very interested in the interreligious dialogue. So I spoke about Ren, traditional Confucian virtue, usually translated as benevolence. It's the integrating virtue, what makes you a good human being for ancient Confucian virtue ethics. And I compared that to Chokmah or Sophia, wisdom in the biblical tradition, as the integrating virtue. They start out both as individual virtues, and then Sophia becomes a cosmic principle, what holds all things together in the Wisdom of Solomon, the Book of Wisdom. And then this is in the background of the Logos. In the Song dynasty, the Neo-Confucian tradition takes Ren and makes it into a cosmic principle. And then for the present, Pope Francis, through St. Francis of Assisi, is interpreting this biblical wisdom tradition that God is present in and through all creation and giving a Catholic appropriation of wisdom in Laudato Si. And Du Weiming is doing something analogous in the Confucian world, reading the earlier traditions with an ecological eye. So in the 12th century, there's a Confucian student who asks his master, "Master, why don't you mow your lawn?" The life force in the lawn is the same as the life force in me. And so Du Weiming interprets that in light of this kind of ecological sensibility to the whole community of life. So those would be two areas where the Vatican is very interested in, the Buddhist tradition and the Confucian tradition. At Georgetown, we co-host an annual Vaishnava Christian dialogue, but this is local. On the Hindu level, Archbishop Felix Machado was there last month. Felix used to be in the Vatican. He's now the retired bishop of Vasai in India, just north of Mumbai. But he's still, I think, the interreligious bishop for the Federation of Asian Bishops' Conferences. So you may know that FABC, the Federation of Asian Bishops' Conferences, has been tremendously creative in articulating principles for Catholic interreligious relationships in the world of Asia, where you have the many poor, the many religions, all the challenges of being a minority often, depending on the country, but a minority in a predominantly Hindu or Buddhist world, and often they've been leaders in this. And so Felix Machado was talking, and the situation in India is still very troubling, unfortunately, because of the Hindutva movement and the current Indian government. There's a lot of this kind of ethnic religious nationalism that I was talking about at the beginning, and this is totally unresolved. The Hindus who come to the dialogue, they completely reject the Hindutva, the Hindu nationalist movement. And often they're very, very close to us in sensibility. Many Hindus completely believe that Jesus is fully divine. See no reason to become Christian over it, but they completely honor Jesus as a divine manifestation. And often their values come very close to ours. But I guess I just haven't been involved in the Vatican level Well, I mean, there was one. When Cardinal Turan came to Georgetown, this is 2015, we had the 50th anniversary of Vatican II. There was a meeting at a Hindu temple in the northeast corner of the Washington, D.C. area with Cardinal Turan, who was then the head of the Pontifical Council for Interreligious Dialogue. And Frank Clooney was there. I attended it also. And Anantanan Rambachan was there. He's my colleague and friend. He's one of the most prominent Hindus in the United States. And he taught at St. Olaf College, a Lutheran college. So he was very much immersed in a Christian theological dialogue for his whole career and ended up doing a book, A Hindu Theology of Liberation, taking ancient Upanishadic principles. If we're all one in Brahman, why do we discriminate on the basis of caste or gender? So it's an internal interpretation of Hindu source texts in dialogue with Christians to kind of challenge the structural biases of traditional Hindu society. So those are some thoughts anyway. Yeah. Yeah, John? Wait, I think they want you to...
I was just thinking of the importance of the economic, which because you did the art and and that.
Right.
I mean, there are movements in Islam in Australia to bring in Islamic banking principles and a whole sense on that. There's the Gameen Bank approach as well. Are there openings in that sort of hard-nosed money world, which actually are different to the current ways of banking?
Are there openings? Yes. Are there a lot of openings? I'm not so sure. Yeah, there's been a lot of discussion. And often my sense is our dialogue partners in other traditions really respect Catholic social teaching as more articulated and more detailed than what they have. In the United States, we had a bishop's document back in the 1980s, Economic Justice for All. I was with a group of rabbis, a priest-rabbi discussion, and I remember one of the rabbis getting up and saying, I wish the Jewish community could speak with one voice on anything in the way that the Catholic bishops were speaking. And so the Jewish leaders were very respectful because often they have similar biblical sources. The whole prophetic tradition challenging the abuse of the poor, shapes both of us. And also shapes Islam. And then more recently, from the Buddhist world, at the dialogue in Castel Gandolfo in 2015, we had arrived right after Pope Francis had issued Laudato Si, and one of the Buddhists, Alan Hosanauka from the San Francisco area, said to the Buddhists that we've talked about a social dharma, but we have nothing as detailed as what the Catholics are doing, and that we Buddhists, he said, need to kind of learn from the Catholics and develop from our own sources. So this is a topic in some interreligious discussions. I'm vaguely aware of the principles for Islamic banking. I've never studied it in any detail, so I really don't know any of the details on that. And dialogue with Muslims depends a lot on what context you're in. In the United States, we've had very strong dialogues with them going back to the 1990s. So this started before the attacks of September 11th and then became more intense after that. And often Muslims would share, in a general sense, the prophetic critique of the abuse of wealth and power and the concern for the poor. Like my teacher on Islam, Fazlur Rahman at the University of Chicago, said there's three basic principles at the early surahs of the Quran. First is there is no God but God. There's a coming judgment. And then God abhors a society in which the poor cannot live in dignity. And so that principle of social justice goes from the very early proclamations of the Prophet Muhammad and then shapes the whole later Islamic tradition. And they have a whole variety of ways of interpreting that. At Georgetown, we have a Center for Muslim Christian Understanding. So we've had a whole series of different Muslim leaders coming in who rethink the basic Islamic principles in light of the realities of the world today. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your very enlightening talk. I think we learned a lot. And one of the things that was very, I think, it's fascinating to me is that a lot of all the good quotes that you mentioned, a lot of the good stuff was done from, even going back to 1893, the first Parliament of the World's Religions in Chicago, where I know even Swami Vivekananda, this is a Hindu, very revered Hindu Swami, so it goes back to your question with the Abrahamic, not just the Abrahamic religions, but most of the best quotes ever, I think, on friendship and all the 5 principles you mentioned stem from all the, like you could say, from the 1800s. And then you gave us examples of 1985, 2019, Pope in India. So thank you for that, because I wasn't aware of that, and it's something to really reflect on. And it somehow feels like we've gone backwards in a way. Like, what do you think are the challenges and opportunities? Like, I'm trying to bridge the past with the present right now, and everything that you've said, and in terms of all those interfaith dialogues and what came out of it, it seems like we need to go back to that in a way, like with what's happening in the world today. What's your suggestions on that, I guess, the challenges and opportunities?
Yeah, on going backward, I think it's true that there's been a resurgence of these kind of ethno-religious nationalisms that in some ways are more powerful now than they were in the recent past. And every tradition has this. In the Buddhist world, I was in Myanmar and learned about the Mabata movement in Myanmar Buddhism. It's a militant Bamar ethnic group. They think only the Bamar Buddhists are the real people in Myanmar, and you have the whole tragedy. And this is behind the earlier atrocities against the Rohingya Muslims and all, and it's just ongoing. My Buddhist friends say that's not Buddhism, but they're interpreting, like they interpret the Mahavamsa, the chronicle in Sri Lanka, as kind of behind this and all. And you also have Buddhist militants in Sri Lanka that, even though they're not killing each other, it's not resolved. There's still a lot of tensions in Sri Lanka. Yeah. Exactly. Oh, yeah. Well, I don't have any solution. Lunch. Yeah, I'm recommending strategies for how we approach this, but I don't have a magic wand. Yeah, no, I mean, what I do is try to network, try to build relations with religious leaders. And what gives me hope is from each of these traditions, I've met wonderful people who are also horrified by what other people in their religious tradition have been doing. Yeah. So. Yeah, the story of Vivekananda is incredible. He was a leader, as kind of a disciple of Ramakrishna, came to Chicago 1893, not realizing he needed an invitation to address the parliament. So he's come all this way, and he's odd man out. So somebody introduces him to a classics professor in either Harvard or another Boston area university. So he takes the train to Boston, gets a letter of recommendation from this classic scholar, takes the train back to Chicago, but loses the letter on the way. He arrives in Chicago in the middle of the night and somehow finds himself in the German-speaking neighborhood on the near North Shore. So here he is. He speaks fluent British English from India, but can't speak German. So he sits down early in the morning on the curb in total despair. Nothing is working out at all. The sun is rising over Lake Michigan, and a woman comes and says, "Would you like to have breakfast?" She was a personal friend, in English. No, he's an Indian. Yeah, he knew English. Oh, yeah. She was a personal friend of John Henry Barrows, the Protestant organizer of the Parliament of the World's Religions. He was totally convinced this is all the work of God. So opening day of the Parliament, he goes to the podium, throws open his arms and says, "My brothers and sisters in America." And the crowd went wild just at that line. Nobody in the Midwest had seen a Hindu before. And then he says all the different religions are like the colors of the rainbow. It's the same light coming through. I experience in Hinduism, but you experience in your... So they learn if somebody else was long and boring and the audience was in danger of going away, they'd send Vivekananda out because he would be a crowd grabber and he would get everybody interested again so that they would stay in their seats. So it was a major moment. And this is how Americans, to a large degree, first came to know about Hinduism through him. Yeah, and then he founded Vedanta societies across the United States. Sir.
I just wanted to make a comment about when you were talking about experience of the transcendent and beauty through the arts. Mm-hmm. My wife is a visual artist, a printmaker, and I was reflecting on her art a couple of years ago, and it occurred to me that, and you can use the word beauty with a capital B, I think, that art is beauty that can no longer remain hidden. Music is beauty that can no longer remain silent. And dance is beauty that can no longer remain still. Mm-hmm. And so to me there's a real experience in when there's a depth, especially in those arts, there's an experience of what we call God or beauty.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yes, thank you for that. Yeah.
There's another one that I love that says, Earth without art is just eh.
Ah.
Eh. So Earth without art is just eh. Like
Yeah.
nothing.
Yeah, you take out the art. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
Yes, look, thank you very much for that talk. So many things come to mind, but maybe there is a slight, I know you're not solving the problems of the world, but there is a hint of it, I think, in the fact that what you've actually brought us tonight was in fact two prongs to the argument, and we tend to focus only on the first. But we as a world have forgotten that the non-humans are our brothers and sisters, which is the second. And I actually think that is a bit of a pathway, in fact, to solving the first. Because if only we all actually recognise that if we started focusing on the non-human, we might sort of realise that the humans are actually, there's not much difference between us. You know, and that's the thing, like they are intimately linked. It's because we're focusing only on the first thing, we're only focusing on us humans. And the problem with, myself, I feel, with actually the theistic religions is there is a tendency to be anthropocentric and chauvinistic. This is a sort of a natural tendency which you know, humans have moulded the religions to be in that direction. So if we focused on prong 2, it would actually help soften that tendency, which I think is part of the root of the divisions between us, because we're all trying to prove that we're right by following the rules which we've constructed as closely as possible, rather than looking at the fundamentals which underlie all. So thank you for that, because I think
thank you for your comment.
that emphasis is important.
Thank you.
Hi, Leo. The whole Catholic Church is so immersed in this synodality process thing. What do you think is the particular contribution of interreligious dialogue that can help us, you know, understand how we can be more synodal, besides having lunch together?
Yeah. When I was writing the introduction to my Christian commentary on the Dhammapada, these are the wisdom sayings of the Buddha, I used the image of walking. So it's an old, ancient Buddhist image of walking the path. And I used the image of trading wisdom sayings as we walk along. So it's not completely clear we're going to the same destination. Nirvana and heaven are not exactly the same. And we have very, very different cosmologies, but we're within earshot of each other. And so I use the image of the pilgrims of Geoffrey Chaucer on the road to Canterbury, which in the actual text of the poem, as I remember, they never reach Canterbury. They're going along, and they're going along, and they're telling stories to each other. And so one image for interreligious dialogue is the original meaning of sun hodos, with the road. We're together on the road, as that we're walking together. And so if we're walking together, we can learn from each other while respecting the difference between our paths. So that would be my hope for this. Ironically, it's often easier in some contexts to do interreligious conversation than conversation with your nearer neighbor. I had a Jewish friend in New York City who for years tried to work at ecumenical Jewish relations. And finally he told me, I'm giving up, I'm going to what's easier, interreligious relations. Because often I can talk very well to a Buddhist friend, like we were with Zhu Shi at Nantian these last few days. I can talk very easily to her. If I have some evangelical Protestants in the United States who don't think I'm a Christian, they would totally disapprove of everything I do in interreligious dialogue. I'm not sure how much I can say to some people who are so deeply suspicious of every other religious path. I'm not sure I have anything I can say that's really going to get through to them. Yeah. And I've had this type of conversation with people from other religious traditions who have an easier time talking to me than some people in their own religious tradition. But I think above all, what we can learn are the skills that are important for deep listening, especially coming out of situations troubled by historic conflicts. And I've certainly heard, like Rabbi David Rosen, leading rabbi, now based in Jerusalem. He's been at Georgetown several times. And I've heard him say, and actually he said it, I think it was here in Melbourne, during the 2009 Parliament, if the Jewish-Catholic relationship could be healed, any relationship can be healed. Because Jews in particular had a long history of what Catholics had done to them. And then this was huge, starting with John the 23rd, and then each of the popes since then has taken steps on that. So, yeah. Sir, wait, get the microphone, I think. I think they want to, record your, please.
Father Leo, my name is John Momis. I'm from Papua New Guinea. Mm-hmm. And I'd like to say that all these dialogues, discussions between or amongst different religious groups won't really help anybody because they are elitistic. They're talking with specialized people, and the common people, the majority of whom are the taxpayers or the people who work, are not allowed to participate because of the lack of adequate information. And I think what we need is to involve the bulk of the people, a lot of people, engage them. And the best way of engaging them, to me, is to liberate them and then empower them. Mm-hmm. Because man is by nature self-determining. Mm-hmm. If you don't, then you are going against that basic right of any human being, whether it's a Christian or Muslim or whatever. Because only man has an intellect and a will. Mm-hmm. If you deny him that right to determine his own destiny, then you are completely ignoring him, not only disempowering him, but you are in fact sinning against him. Because man by nature is self-determining. So I think what we need, for example, in Papua New Guinea, the government spends a lot of money on universities and other things, but they don't really help the people. The bulk of the people are completely ignored. They're dealing with the elites, and the elites' interest is not the interest of the commoners, the common people. So how do we empower the people?
In the Catholic approach to dialogue, the all-encompassing dialogue is the dialogue of life. This is the dialogue of neighbors. The dialogue of the intellectuals is only one of 4 forms of dialogue, the dialogue of the theological exchange. Yeah. And so in our experience in America, interreligious dialogue is a common everyday experience. Our students at Georgetown are in class with Muslims, Jews, Christians. I've had a Sikh student, many Hindus, and so on. And this is a constant daily experience for them. I used to co-chair a Jewish Catholic dialogue, and these were ordinary parishioners in the church where I live in Washington, D.C., with Jews from Hebrew congregation in Washington, led by a rabbi born in Vienna, Austria in 1919. So he was 19 years old when the Nazis took over. But the dialogue people were ordinary participants in their parishes. They weren't trained scholars in academic discourse. In Chicago, at least when I was there was a dialogue of the women, Jewish, Christian, and Muslim in the northwest suburbs. On the south side, there was a dialogue of African-American Muslims and Catholics. In Milwaukee, there was a dialogue of women, both Muslim and Catholic. And again, these are ordinary people. They're not trained in interreligious dialogue. They don't have a theological education. And there's constant interaction, certainly in any urban area in the United States, on an ongoing basis between Jews, Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists. And often people talk about their religious practice with each other. And so this is the ground from which the Catholic Church sees interreligious dialogue as arising. So in my view, we need both and. So we need some people who are trained in interreligious studies and can do this with some level of academic expertise. We need the leaders of the church, the Sangha, the Ummah, the synagogues, all of the different major leaders. But like my friend Vincent Shaker, Indian Jesuit, he used to represent the Society of Jesus for Interreligious Relations in South Asia. He has a book, Building Strong Neighborhoods. And he's thinking of the context in India, where sometimes political actors want to stir up opposition so they can defend the Hindu character of India. And his proposal is, if the local religious leader is doing their job properly, they have more credibility than the higher level people. And so if there's a friendship between local leaders, that can set up an atmosphere of friendship on the local level that can resist outside political actors coming in. In Kuala Lumpur, I visited my friend Clarence Devadas. Today he's in charge of research for the Archdiocese, but he was a parish priest where there were Hindus, Buddhists, and Muslims. And so on a local level, this again is grassroots, he was talking to the local religious leaders and the local people. So a lot of them don't have any academic training at all, but they had their own local Buddhist, Hindu, Muslim, Christian dialogue establishing friendships. This is why I closed with friendship. So friendship does not require any elite level of education, and friendship can be transformative. So I completely agree on your call for liberation. What that means in any particular context will be a matter of controversy, because not everybody agrees on what political or economic strategy is best for liberation. But certainly the Catholic Church embraces the call itself.
We have, the church in Papua New Guinea, I think, has failed to take the Papua New Guinea Constitution, national goals and directive principles seriously. We are the only constitution in the world which has the 5 national goals and directive principles, the first of which is integral human development, holistic development. Number 2, equality and participation, the right of people to participate. In PNG, the majority are marginalized, so that Mr. Know-all can decide everything for them because the people are bush people, they don't know enough. The third goal is self-reliance and national sovereignty. The problem in PNG, I was an ambassador in China. I visited the Great Wall of China, and I was told that the Chinese built this wall to protect themselves from the Mongolians who used to walk in and slaughter them. The Mongolians were not stupid. So they went straight to the gatekeeper, gave him money and walked in and killed the Chinese. That's what's happening in Papua New Guinea. The leaders are being bribed, and the people walk in who don't have the best interests of people at heart and manipulate the people because the leaders are bought off. So what I'm saying is, instead of just talking about my relationship with my God, it's important. I must, I must ensure that I recognize my God. The public interpersonal relationship, I must think of my community and so on and so forth. But I don't think even those two are enough. We must also be concerned about the public dimension of human existence. And that's where the churches should encourage Catholics or Christians to influence public policies, good laws, good policies. Otherwise, we are busy teaching catechism and all this sort of stuff, and those who are in power are manipulating and ignoring the ignorance of the population. So those three things should happen simultaneously.
Right.
That is the problem.
Yeah.
Problem of simultaneity, simultaneous, what do you call it, application.
Right. Right. Yeah, I've never been to Papua New Guinea and don't have any expertise at all, so I'm
We are
happy
the
to
only
learn from you.
country. We are the only country, I think, in the world which rejected the Jesuits.
Oh, they were thrown out of Ethiopia.
No.
They've been thrown out of more countries than probably, and then they were suppressed.
We had three Jesuits.
Yeah, they were thrown out of,
They were
Portugal, I think, and then Spain, and then France, and then they were thrown out of everywhere except Russia. Georgetown University was founded by Jesuits when there were no Jesuits except in Russia, because Catherine the Great did not obey the Pope on suppressing
the
the
ones
Jesuits.
in Papua New Guinea were not thrown out by rebels.
Yeah.
They were thrown out by a Catholic archbishop who demanded that they must run parishes, which they couldn't.
Yeah.
Two were teaching at the university. One was running a Catholic Social Institute,
Oh, yeah.
which was doing a great job, and they couldn't run. So the provincial in Melbourne recalled them back to Australia, and consequently, we are suffering the ignorance of people who are just looking after parishes. Sorry, thank you very much.
Yeah. No, I agree completely on your basic point that we need to lobby political actors. I mean, certainly the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops is constantly issuing policy recommendations. From what I hear within the U.S. Congress, they view the U.S. Catholic bishops as one more lobbying group. And so in the U.S. Congress, there are countless different people with their agenda. Now, where interreligious stuff comes in is the hope of the interreligious movement is if different religious leaders from different traditions can speak together, that can work as a force multiplier. On the local level, Saul Alinsky in Chicago set up the Industrial Areas Foundation for grassroots organization on a local level between interreligious actors. And this would include a lot of people who have no formal education in religious things. But it's looking at what's the problem in our neighborhood, who's the political actor, how do we get to lobby, and if you have different religious actors coming together, that convergence, we hope, will have more of a persuasive impact on the political leaders and decision makers. But this is always local, and so there's huge numbers of frustrations, and there's many, many areas in which in my own country we have massive problems that I have no magic wand to resolve, unfortunately. So, but thank you very much, sir, for your comments. Yeah.